May 8, 1945. 2:17 p.m. A detention facility near Davis's, Wiltshire. The convoy of lorries wound through Hampshire's narrow lanes under a sky the color of wet slate. Rain drummed against canvas tarps stretched over the truck beds where 30 German generals sat in silence, their field-gray uniforms darkened by moisture and defeat. General Friedrich Müller, aged 54, pressed his palm against the cold metal railing and watched the English countryside roll past through gaps in the tarp. 3 days earlier, he had commanded a panzer division near Lundberg. Now he was cargo-bound for internment on an enemy island he had been taught to despise. He had expected ruins. The Luftwaffe had pounded British cities for years, or so the Reich Ministry of Propaganda claimed. London was rubble. Liverpool had burned to ash. The people starved behind their barricades, clinging to survival by American charity alone. Britain was on its knees, begging for mercy, one winter away from surrender. But through that gap in the canvas, Müller saw dairy cows grazing in emerald fields. He saw a village with intact church spires. He saw children playing cricket on a village green while smoke rose from chimneys. Not the smoke of bombardment, but the comfortable smoke of coal fires and Sunday roasts. His jaw tightened, not from anger, from confusion. The lorry slowed as it approached the camp gates. A British corporal stepped forward, clipboard in hand, and began checking names against a list. No shouting, no rifle butts to the ribs, just bureaucratic efficiency. Another corporal offered Miller a cigarette player's navy cut from a proper tin. Miller stared at the extended hand. That cigarette freely given to a defeated enemy would undo everything he thought he knew about strength. If this story challenges what you thought you knew about World War II, you're not alone. Hit subscribe because this channel reveals the moments they didn't teach you in school. The uncomfortable truths that change how we understand history. For 12 years, Friedrich Müller and men like him had absorbed a consistent narrative about Britain and the British people. It began in the beer halls of Munich in 1933 when Müller was a young Wehrmacht captain. Goebbels's propaganda films painted Britain as a decadent empire in terminal decline. A nation of shopkeepers grown fat on colonial exploitation. Soft, degenerate, led by Jewish financiers and corrupt politicians who sent working-class boys to die while they sipped champagne in London clubs. The newsreel showed breadlines in Manchester, unemployed miners in Wales, hunger marches in the streets. The message was clear. Britain was rotting from within, waiting for a strong hand to sweep away the weakness. Then came the war, May 1940. The fall of France. Müller, now a colonel, had stood on the cliffs of Killala and watched the British Expeditionary Force flee across the Channel, abandoning their equipment, their allies, their dignity. Dunkirk, the propaganda ministry called it, was proof that British soldiers would always run when confronted with German steel. The Luftwaffe would finish them. Hermann Göring promised it personally. London would burn. The civilian population would panic. Churchill would be forced to sue for peace within weeks. But the weeks became months. The months became years. And London inexplicably refused to burn properly. By 1945, Müller had developed a more nuanced view. The British were stubborn. He'd give them that. They had American supplies. Russian blood was grinding down the Eastern Front. But surely now with their cities bombed, their empire crumbling, their treasury empty, they would be bitter, vengeful, broken. Surely they would take their revenge on captured German officers. The Geneva Convention was a piece of paper. Müller had signed it once in another lifetime when wars were fought between gentlemen. But this was total war. The gloves were off. The British had every reason to be brutal. On the transport ship from Cuxhaven to Southampton, Müller and his fellow generals had discussed their fate in whispered conversations below deck. Some expected execution. Others predicted forced labor in coal mines or factories. The optimists hoped for basic survival, thin soup, hard beds, and the slow grind of waiting for a war crimes tribunal that might or might not come. None of them expected cigarettes. None of them expected what they were about to see. The camp at Devizes was a converted military barracks surrounded by wire but not by watchtowers with machine guns. British soldiers in battle dress stood at the gates but their Leanfield rifles remained slung over their shoulders. A British major, impossibly young, perhaps 30, greeted the arriving generals with a salute. Not a mocking salute, a proper military salute. "Gentlemen," he said in decent German, "I am Major Peaton. You will be processed, assigned quarters, and provided with Red Cross registration forms. Medical inspection is voluntary, but recommended. Questions will be answered in due course." Müller glanced at General Heinrich Hoffmann, who had commanded artillery divisions in North Africa. Hoffmann's expression mirrored his own wary confusion. The processing took 3 hours. Names recorded, personal effects inventoried and stored, not confiscated. They were photographed for identification, searched for weapons, and issued camp numbers. Then they were led to their quarters, not cells, but barrack rooms with wooden bunks, thin mattresses, and wool blankets. Real blankets, not rags. At 7 p.m., a bell rang for supper. The generals filed into a messole expecting cabbage water and black bread. Instead, the British cook served mutton stew, potatoes, tinned peas, and fresh bread. The portions were smaller than Wehrmacht officer standards, but they were honest portions. The mutton was real. The bread was only slightly stale. Müller ate slowly, analyzing every mouthful for poison or for signs of mockery, finding neither. After supper, Major Petain appeared again. "Gentlemen, I must inform you that your accommodation is subject to Red Cross inspection which will occur next Tuesday. In accordance with the Geneva Convention, you are entitled to write 1 letter per week to family members subject to censorship. You will not be required to perform labor. You are however expected to maintain discipline within your own ranks and follow camp regulations. Any questions?" Müller raised his hand. "Major, when will interrogations begin?" Petain looked genuinely confused. "Interrogations, General?" "Yes. Intelligence gathering. Enhanced questioning." "Ah." Peitain's expression cleared. "There will be no interrogations. You are prisoners of war, not intelligence assets. If you wish to volunteer information for historical record, that can be arranged. Otherwise, you'll be left in peace." The room went silent. General Hoffmann spoke up, his voice carefully neutral. "Major, forgive me, but our Air Force bombed your cities for 4 years. Your merchant ships are at the bottom of the Atlantic. Your men died at Dunkirk in North Africa and Italy. And you serve us, mutton." Peain's jaw tightened slightly. The first crack in his professional facade. But when he spoke, his voice remained even. "General, Britain signed the Geneva Convention in 1929. We have no intention of breaking that commitment simply because our enemies found it inconvenient. Good evening, gentlemen." He turned and left. Müller stared at his empty plate. The mutton had been real. The threat of torture had not materialized, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a small question began to form. On the 8th day of captivity, the generals were informed they could volunteer for supervised walks outside the camp. The British called it exercise privilege contingent on parole, a signed promise not to attempt escape. Müller signed. What was the point of escaping? Germany had surrendered. There was nowhere to go except back to Aschen occupation zones. The walk took them through Devizes itself, a market town that showed no signs of having been bombed. Shops were open. The post office operated. Women queued outside the butcher with ration books, complaining about the shortness of bacon supplies, but not about starvation. A group of children played with a football in a side street. When the convoy of German generals passed, supervised by 3 bored-looking British soldiers, the children stopped and stared. But they didn't throw stones. They didn't spit. They simply watched, curious, as one might watch exotic animals from a zoo. One child, a boy of perhaps 8, waved. Miller, by reflex, nodded back. At the town square, they passed a war memorial from the Great War, 1914-1918, listing hundreds of local dead. Fresh wreaths lay at its base. A woman in black was adding flowers. General Hoffmann slowed, reading the names. 32 men from this town died at the Somme, he muttered in 1 week. Müller said nothing, but he thought, these people have every reason to hate us. They returned to camp in silence. The camp library was modest, donated books mostly, and old newspapers with the war news carefully excised, but they could read fiction. Dickens, Hardy, Conan Doyle. Müller, who had studied English at university before the war, picked up Great Expectations and read it slowly, reacquainting himself with the language. One afternoon, Major Petain entered the library to check on something with the camp librarian. He spotted Müller with his book and paused. Dickens' General, ambitious choice. I read it at H. Heilberg, Müller replied in English. 1928, my professor said Dickens understood class better than Marx. Petain smiled faintly. Your professor was either very wise or very heretical. Both perhaps. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Petain said quietly, General, may I ask you something? Soldier to soldier, not captor to prisoner. Müller nodded carefully. Did you believe the propaganda about Britain? I mean about us being on the brink of starvation and collapse. Müller considered lying, but there seemed little point. Yes, he said finally, especially after 1940. We were told London was in ruins. Liverpool had burned. Your people were eating sawdust bread. The new reels showed it. Gerbil's ministry had photographers. Had photographers stage shots in bombed neighborhoods, Petain finished. And edited out everything that contradicted the narrative. Muller set down his book. You understand what you are doing to us, don't you, Major? I'm not sure I follow this. Muller gestured around the library, the camp, the entire peculiar arrangement. The mutton, the cigarettes, the walks through your intact villages, the Red Cross inspections, the Geneva Convention honored to the letter. You are dismantling everything we were told about who you are. Peaton's expression was unreadable. Is that a complaint, General? It is a statement of fact. Muller picked up his book again. And facts, Major, are more destabilizing than any interrogation you might have conducted. Petain nodded slowly and left without another word. When the Red Cross representatives arrived, Swiss observers with clipboards and cameras, Muller expected theater, a show inspection to generate propaganda for the British press. Instead, the inspectors were given unrestricted access to every building, every record, every prisoner who wished to speak with them. They interviewed generals privately without British supervision. They photographed the kitchens, the latrines, the sleeping quarters. They took notes. A Swiss doctor, gay-haired and meticulous, examined Muller and 15 other prisoners. He checked their teeth, their weight, their general health. At the end, he asked, "General, have you experienced any mistreatment or abuse since your capture?" Muller hesitated. The honest answer felt absurd. "No, doctor, none. Your rations are adequate. Yes, you have received medical care when needed. I have not needed it, but others have received treatment." Promptly, the doctor made a notation. "Thank you, General." 2 days later, Miller learned the inspection report rated Davis's camp as fully compliant with Geneva Convention standards. The British had known the Red Cross was coming. They had not staged anything. They had simply continued their policy. General Hoffmann, who had fought in Russia and seen what happened when Geneva Conventions were ignored, said what they were all thinking. They didn't have to do this. No, Muller agreed. They didn't. Britain's treatment of German prisoners of war was not accidental sentimentality. It was calculated policy built on 4 institutional pillars. First, security. According to documents now held at the National Archives at Kew, British military intelligence concluded early in the war that brutal treatment of PS created fanatical resistance. Humane treatment, by contrast, encouraged compliance and reduced escape attempts. A well-fed, fairly treated prisoner was easier to manage than a desperate one. Between 1939 and 1945, Britain held over 400,000 German prisoners of war on British soil. The mortality rate was under 0.3%. Escapes were rare and almost universally unsuccessful. The policy worked. Second, intelligence. Cooperative prisoners talked not under torture, which produced false confessions and propaganda victories for the enemy, but under conditions of psychological comfort. Men who were treated with basic dignity were more likely to volunteer information about troop movements, supply conditions, morale issues, data that proved invaluable for Allied intelligence services. The interrogation centers at Trent Park and Latimer House recorded thousands of hours of conversations between German officers who believed they were simply chatting among themselves. The rooms were bugged. The intelligence gathered helped shorten the war. Third, diplomatic reciprocity. Britain held German prisoners. Germany held British prisoners. Every violation of the Geneva Convention invited retaliation. The British government, led by Churchill himself, understood this arithmetic. Treat enemy prisoners well, and your own men had a better chance of similar treatment. It didn't always work. The Japanese ignored Geneva entirely, but with Germany, the calculation held. German camps for British PS were harsh, but rarely murderous. The reciprocity, though imperfect, saved lives on both sides. Fourth, moral commitment. Britain had signed the Geneva Convention in 1929 and ratified it in 1931. Throughout the war, despite the bombing of civilians, despite the U-boat campaign, despite everything, the British government insisted it would honor that signature. Not because it was easy, not because it was deserved, but because it was who Britain insisted it was. As one War Office memo from 1943 bluntly stated, "If we descend to the enemy's level, we surrender the moral authority upon which our cause depends." This was not naive. It was strategic morality. Late at night, June 1945, Muller lay in his bunk, staring at the wooden slats above him. Outside, a nightingale sang in the Wiltshire countryside, a sound he hadn't heard since boyhood summers in Bavaria. The question kept returning, no matter how many times he tried to dismiss it. If the propaganda about British cruelty was false, and it was demonstrably, empirically false, what else had been a lie? He had believed the newsreels about London burning. False. He had believed Britain was starving. They were rationed certainly, but not starving. He had believed the British people were weak, degenerate, ready to surrender. But they had endured 5 years of war, bombed their own cities rather than surrender them, and now they treated their defeated enemies with a bureaucratic decency that felt more threatening than any torture. If those lies were so complete, so convincing, what about the others? What about the reports from the Eastern Front? The rumors about camps in Poland that were never quite explained. The trainloads of people disappearing into the East. The orders that were never written down, but everyone understood. Miller had told himself those were exaggerations. Enemy propaganda. Surely no civilized nation would. But if Britain could be lied about so thoroughly, could anything the Reich Ministry said be trusted? The Nightingale sang on, indifferent to history. 3 months later in August 1945, the generals at Davies were shown British newsreels of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. The footage was not edited. The bodies were real. The survivors were skeletal. The British narrator's voice was steady but strained. Some of the generals wept. Others sat in stone-faced silence. A few walked out. Müller watched every frame. He had commanded troops on the Eastern Front in 1941 and 1942. He had heard rumors then. He had chosen not to investigate. It was not his jurisdiction, someone else's responsibility. He had a panzer division to lead. Now watching British soldiers bulldoze piles of corpses into mass graves, he understood exactly what his willful ignorance had enabled. The British had shown them this footage deliberately, not as revenge, not as humiliation, but as education. You served this, the footage said, this is what your honor was spent defending. 10 years later, Friedrich Müller died in 1955 in Stuttgart in a modest apartment he shared with his sister. He never rejoined the German military, though the new Bundeswehr would have welcomed a man of his experience. In his final years, he taught history at a local secondary school. His students remembered him as demanding but fair, a man who insisted they question their sources and never accept official narratives at face value. He kept one object from his time in British captivity, a battered tin mug, standard British Army issue, from which he had drunk countless cups of unsweetened tea. It sat on his desk at school, dented and stained. When students asked about it, he would say, "This mug taught me more about strength than 12 years of propaganda ever did." He never explained further, but in his desk drawer, carefully preserved, was a letter he wrote in 1946 to Major Peaton. It was never sent. In it, he tried to express gratitude for something he could not quite name. Not for kindness exactly, but for the demonstration that civilization could survive even in victory. The letter ended with a single line. "You did not have to treat us as human beings. That you did so is something I am still learning to understand." The story of German generals confronting British decency is not a story about British moral superiority. The British Empire was built on violence and exploitation. British cities were protected by the blood of colonial subjects who had little choice in the matter. The RAF firebombed Dresden and killed tens of thousands of civilians. This is not a story about heroes and villains. It's a story about the power of institutional restraint under pressure. About how propaganda works by controlling what people see, not just what they are told. About how small gestures, a cigarette offered, a meal provided, a convention honored, can shatter certainties more effectively than any lecture. The German generals who passed through British P camps discovered that the enemy they'd been taught to despise had treated them better than their own propaganda claimed they would be treated. And that discovery forced them to question everything else they believed, which is perhaps the most subversive thing Britain could have done. If this story challenged your assumptions about World War II, there are dozens more like it on this channel. Subscribe and let's keep questioning what we thought we knew, because history is rarely as simple as we were taught.